Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 217. Quick logistical reminder, please follow the live stream on LinkedIn or YouTube. The topic today is 5 billion passkeys. Are we done yet? Our guest today is returning guest today is Rolf Lindemann, VP of Products at OneSpan, the company formerly known as Vasco. Welcome, Rolf.
Thank you, Mike.
So I'm quite excited to have you back. It might have been 2 years because you said we were on episode 29. That was probably in 24, right?
Yeah, that could well be, yes.
So a lot has been happening in passkeys, and I think it's one of like the most sort of underappreciated sort of like changes that we've seen, and I want to keep doing periodically doing an episode on passkeys just to check in, and I felt you were the perfect person to do that with as one of the co-founders of Knock Knock and the FIDO Alliance, and so you're have a PhD in FIDO basically at this point.
Yes. Yeah, I can just say I'm happy to be here, and it's great to see FIDO success, right? When we started FIDO with 6 people in a room, right, we couldn't even dream of 5 billion passkeys out there, and the term passkeys was not coined at that stage either, right? So it feels like a big success, and it's great. I'm really grateful for that success so far. It was a long work, right? A long journey towards to here.
Right. Well, that's actually a good pivot because I always like to make sure that we cover the question raised in the title. So I'm just going to start right there with the first question. And okay, so we're at 5 billion 5 billion passkeys. But is that victory? Does that mean that's roughly how many people there are on the planet who have used the internet? And what does that actually mean? Because when I talk to people, I'm not sure everyone is using passkeys. So what does adoption currently look like today?
Let's start there, right? So when we started FIDO, it was all about high security needs and device-bound keys. Even though our mission in FIDO was to reduce the reliance on passwords, the actual reality is that the technology and the specs were focused on the MFA replacement more than on password replacement. It really, in my opinion, needed the synced passkey approach from 22 that were introduced to get to the point where we could practically replace the passwords and not only the legacy MFA methods. And for me, this is one of the reasons why we see a lot of adoption, especially in what I would call convenience-centric markets, meaning in use cases where there is no formal certification or legal requirement for strong MFA. It's more like, yep, I could use a password alone, but I want more security and I want more convenience. And so e-commerce is one example. Social media would be another example. You could even argue that the platforms like Google and Apple, and they give you, right? Yes, they give you some authentication. You could argue it was MFA before. That's true, but they have no legal obligation. Right? It's their own decision. They are not regulated like banks are to use passkeys. So that's a different requirement. So we see biggest adoption at this stage there. But maybe to put the 5 billion in perspective, right? If we have, I don't know, like 5 billion people on the internet, and on average people have 100 accounts, right? We need many more, right? That's passkeys. But nevertheless, 5 billion is a lot. And I'm really happy that we reached that point and relatively quickly, right? I'm not aware of many other technologies that got to that inflection point so quickly.
So how do you actually know it's 5 billion? How are we measuring that?
So in the FIDO lines, we have groups where many people sit together and talk about their existing deployments. They don't do that publicly, and there are many large relying parties, including in that meeting, and they share numbers. And that is why they sat together, and now aggregate number was more than 5 billion. That is worth a press release. And so we in FIDO aligned that press release with the passkey report, adoption report for 26. I think that
So,
was done at the Authenticate APEC conference earlier this year.
so the goal isn't only adoption of passkeys, but it's really moving away from passwords, which represent the risk of phishing, which is the main attack. Um, so are we actually seeing passwords disappear or at least slow down?
So there are some deployments where users are allowed to not use a password, which means they don't have a password. And there's one deployment that is Sony with their PlayStation authentication method. And they said we are fully passwordless, meaning there is no password anymore. You must, if you are a user, you must use a passkey to get access, which I think is great. But to be honest, that's the only deployment that I'm aware of where they went from passwords to passwordless in a single step. In most existing deployments that I'm aware of, right, they go in multiple steps. Right? That doesn't happen overnight. The first thing is passkeys are an opt-in. Right? Maybe it's even downplayed to just make sure you get some information that you measure, hopefully, right? Information about the adoption. Is that the feedback from the users great, right? Before you then make that more prominent after you have convinced yourself, right, that the user experience you have created, the wordings, the iconography, etc., that all meets the customer expectation or users' expectations, and now users can use that and then scale up, and then you drive up the adoption of passkeys, and at some point you can start making the use of passwords harder, right, to really start phasing out the passwords. Doesn't mean you are passwordless yet, and then at some point you are fully passwordless. The challenges, to be honest, today are often in the situation where you get to the edge cases, right? Where today there's always a need. You authenticate maybe on a kiosk PC, right? In a hotel, for example, right? You can't plug in a security key. FIDO cross-device authentication doesn't work because all communication interfaces are locked down. What are you doing there, right, to authenticate your users, right? And there's some others. Recovery, you could argue, is another interesting situation, right? You reduce significantly the account recovery frequency by using pass keys, right? And we have some data, and that was even published on that. But you don't get it to zero, meaning you have to provide an account recovery method, and that could be an identity proofing method. But magic links don't give you phishing resistance, and so that typically stands in the way to a fully phishing resistant deployment, which is fully passwordless, right? So, and I think that is exactly where other modern credentials like digital credentials might fit in as well, right, to solve the user onboarding identity proofing challenge and get away from the selfie plus picture ID, which is attackable, especially through deepfakes and AI today.
So if you were starting a new social network, would you offer passwords or would you only allow registration with passkeys? So let's say you're starting, I'm curious what you think about that.
No, I'm not sure I would start a social network, but I think with social networks, you need to take the users where they are, right? In our countries, I would say that the majority will be able to use passkeys, but there might be a percentage of the user base which is not willing to do that yet, right? They are not the early adopters, right? They are not the early majority. They might be the late majority or the laggards in some way to adopt the technology. So transformation takes time. So I'm pretty sure starting a social network, you have to start both. Starting a new bank, the situation might be different.
And we talked before the episode started about the software supply chain and how it's really important to make sure that the developers who are committing code to a public repository, like NPM, for example, and we really need to know that they haven't been phished. What about for that case? So social network, you say no because there are accessibility issues. But what about for like a software repository?
I think there are more high security use cases, and you could also argue that inside workforce, right? Passkeys are the best authentication method, especially if you have targeted people and the software repositories. Those are people which are targeted by attackers, right? So I think to enforce the use of a phishing-resistant method is a good idea there. However, you might get into interesting situations where is it a human or are we getting into agents, right? Non-human identities, potentially there's an equivalent in the e-commerce world, right, where it might be agentic commerce, where people have their agents acting on behalf of those people, where you need to verify the delegation, right? And that is another interesting problem. I would say this is orthogonal to passkeys, but it needs to be phishing resistant as well. And we need to find methods to do that in a much better way than just handing off usernames and passwords or potentially even passkeys to machines, because we want to provide guardrails, right, to avoid machines going off and doing things they shouldn't be doing with the power of the passkeys or the credentials in general they might be using now.
That it brings up a good point. One of the questions I prepared is, how do we bind a transaction to a person using a passkey? For example, I'm a user of Coinbase, and when I send Bitcoin to an external wallet, they have me use my physical token.
Yes.
But any thoughts? And how much do you see that actually happening? Is that becoming common? And what are some of the challenges around that today? Do you think that
Yeah.
that's ready for prime
Yes.
time?
So I see that there are two principal ways to use credentials, right? The first is for session authentication. The second is for transaction approval, right? And for transaction approval, there's one more thing. You need to be able, as a user, to see the transaction details, and the relying party needs typically some kind of evidence that the user was able to see it, right? And there was no overlay attack and no other things that could have happened, and that is pretty relevant, especially in the banking situation, financial services. And if you look at the PSD2 regulation, you see that there's even a requirement there, right? If you look up the article on the RTS regarding dynamic linking, right, the user must be able to see it, right? It sounds very easy, but in practice, it's more complex, and regulators have different opinions on that. However, right, some FIDO protocols, FIDO UF, where transaction confirmation was just an integral part of that. There are other FIDO protocols like FIDO2 and web authentication, where people created, and actually that was me, I think, created a pull request to add transaction confirmation support and as an official extension into that. And this is still pending. We are trying to get it through, and there are some positive signs that people want to see that, because that's often the case, that you want to approve a specific transaction and provide the transaction context if you are talking about human transaction approval. And we also see practical solutions right now, right? For example, with my new company, OneSpan, which acquired not where I was working for before, we have a prototype FX2 device, which is a hardware token, which has a display. And actually, we can convey all the transaction details to that hardware token, right, through FIDO Rails. And that is great, because now I can sit at my computer, could be a computer with a browser on it, without any proprietary software installed on that, right? Just how it comes from the factory in the machine. I plug my FX2 prototype device to that, and the bank could send me all the transaction data down to that device. It would be shown there. I could swipe my finger to approve the transaction, and that gives me what you see is what you sign, or there's a strong dynamic linking that is required by PSD2 as well. So there are solutions in the short term banks can use, even though in the long term we are still working on getting that official extension into web authentication. And if people are interested about that, please chime in. Right, there is an open issue to reopen that pull request 2020 about the transaction confirmation and web authentication, and help me to convince the remaining browser vendors to actually implement that approach.
You touched a little bit on account recovery before, and I just wanted to dive into that a little bit more. I think in like 2012, I wrote the first blog at Glue about how account recovery is the Achilles heel of security. Um, you mentioned magic links. Like, why bother with phishing-resistant credentials if you just use email? But could you talk a little bit about this state of account recovery right now?
Oh, for sure. So it was interesting. So the first deployments we made with device-bound passkeys, we saw a significant reduction of the account recovery frequency, which typically is the forget password or forgot password flow. Right? That was reduced by 80 to 90%, I think 89% actually, as a reduction, right, relative from where they were to what they are now. And you could look into how many devices are changed per year and how many devices are lost per year, which is roughly around 3% per year, right? And the numbers match, right? Match up pretty well. So meaning if you're using device-bound passkeys only, you might end up with a account recovery rate around like 3% per year, but not more. Right? Because that's a rate where people lose their smartphones, and if it's a device-bound key, that's where the key is gone. You need something new. You need account recovery in some way or multiple credentials. With synced passkeys, the world is different, right? Because if I have my synced passkey, I might still have a tablet or a laptop, right? Even if I lose my smartphone, I can have access to my synced passkey. So it gets reduced below 1% rate. So it's a relatively rare situation that I need to recover my account, meaning get back in without having access to my existing passkey. But it's not zero. And now, what could I do as a relying party to do that? And the first thing, the good news is it's so rare that I can do more heavy lifting, right? To implement that more securely, more than just a magic link, right? Second is, in order to have a phishing-resistant account, I have to do more because the magic link doesn't give you the phishing resistance, and most other alternatives don't either, right? Some industries are regulated, mobile network operators, because of the SIM swap attacks, right? They are regulated with account recovery to have more stringent procedures than just email magic links. So for them, it's already heavy lifting, so they benefit most from that. And for me, this is where digital credentials come into play in one way or the other, because the ultimate resort to do identity proofing really is to leverage your passport, your identity card, or your driver's license, right? Some government issued picture ID, which is hardware backed in some way, and now you need to use that. The way we use it today with selfie plus picture ID is not very robust, and deepfake attacks get in that way. Digital credentials going forward will provide you a much better way. For me, this could be the solution for the account recovery and account creation scenario, right? Allow that digital credential to be presented, the PID credential, to then get back to your account and get a new passkey for the daily authentications.
Right. So it's Nirvana, basically. I have a
Very
government
dynamic
issued
and very
ID where I can
fast-paced.
assert my identity, and that sounds like that's here in the United States. That sounds really long in the future, but who knows? I
Yeah,
agree
but
that that would
especially
be the
in the
ideal.
United States, right? Look how often you use your driver's license, and it might be more often in a hotel or in other situations than actually in conjunction with a car. But there's some identity, right? And with the real identity, real ID requirements now, right? Those government issued physical identity cards have more relevance, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you need for
So,
security. Yeah.
so this is an identity issue. It's a human identity issue. It's not a passkey issue. you know.
So you could argue they both come together, right? Let's assume you are a sync fabric, meaning you are a passkey provider, and you have many users now having their sync passkeys. How would they bootstrap the sync passkey provider or the credential manager in general on a new device the first time? In an ideal case, they can somehow leverage the existing device, but if they've lost the existing device, they cannot. Right? How do
Right.
you make sure it's really that user? Identity proofing through a digital credential could be a very good solution to that, and one that's actually secure enough to do all that. Right?
Yeah.
So for me, this is a good way, and this is where both worlds come together. Remember, FIDO stands for Fast Identity Online. In the beginning, the question was often, yeah, but what does it have to do with identity? Authentication and passkeys was abstracted away. It was exactly not identity, right? It was just the recognition, right? The returning
Yeah.
user. Now we see identity proofing and digital credential and all the work we FIDO do in that space, right? That gets into, right, and gets combined. Now we are really Fast Identity Online because we have to deal with both aspects.
Um, okay. Um, I wanted to actually, I don't normally do demos here, but I wanted to show you, I showed you this demo before, and I just wanted to do it again for the audience. I'm going to do a rare screen sharing. So this is, so this is I think one of the challenges with passkeys and security keys. It can get complex. So here we have basically my credential manager, and I have a couple of passkeys registered, and including iCloud keychain. And I want to register Chrome because I have Chrome password manager. So I don't know why I'm getting a Dashlane prompt here. And I don't know why. Okay, this is my platform key, I guess, my iCloud keychain. And now I'm presented with, okay, this is the one I want, Chrome. And then I can use my passkey to unlock it. Chrome password manager, right? So I guess my point is, and I'll stop the screen share. Sorry, everyone. I'm terrible at screen sharing. So the point is that these passkey flows are getting complex. So especially if you have a security key plugged in, which I know is the exception, it can trigger all kinds of defaults. But the complexity, like you said, it started out nice and easy. You'd use your passkey as almost like your second factor. But now it's gotten way more complex. We have more devices. We have device-bound keys. We have physical keys, and there are design decisions sort of implicit in your browser that you might not know about. So is passkeys like getting too complex, and is this complexity stopping like companies from wanting to deploy it because they're afraid of all these potential edge cases?
I think we have to differentiate two aspects here. One is what is inherent to passkeys, right? And the way the spec works and it's supposed to work. And second, what is specific to the configuration on that machine, right? So the first prompt that you clicked away was a password manager, which I'm pretty sure is like an add-on to your browser, right?
Correct.
That intercepts. So
And,
there
and
are.
by the way, I wanted to mention Dashlane before because you said, how do you bootstrap your shared provider? And Dashlane, I have a YubiKey that basically bootstraps my, which makes it kind of portable. But yeah, that it does run as a browser extension. And you're right. So it was a local passkey manager.
They got in the way before even the platform itself could prompt for the right passkey provider to select, which in my opinion is a major UX issue. And in my opinion is a reason why, and that's a generic thing here, the world is moving from over-the-top solutions like passwords and OTPs to platform-mediated credentials like passkeys and digital credentials, where the platform takes the role of controlling and asking the user, selecting the right credential manager for that approach to make that nicer. Right? So the first thing is that thing would go away if that credential manager vendor wouldn't have to implement a plugin or an add-on and could, as opposed to doing that, could plug into the platform itself and let the platform mediate user select the appropriate password manager, passkey provider or credential manager for that task. Right? Now that gets us to the second part of that. This is how could the platform or the relying party influence that decision to make it an equal choice between a passkey on a credential manager or platform authenticator, we have used that term in the past often, versus a security key you might have inserted into your platform. And in the specification, there are the way methods to do so with public key credential hints, where you can say, even in an ordered by priority list, right? Start with the security key or start with a platform authenticator, right? A device managed credential, and second, continue with the security key and then do the CETA hybrid flow, right? Or just lead with one and omit the others if it's clear from the context for the relying party that the security key cannot be used or shouldn't be used, right? Or the security key even must be used, in which case you don't want the platform authenticator, meaning the Chrome and the other things to get in the way, right? So that's the second thing. The third aspect is, I would say, competition. That if you look into different browsers and platforms, how they implement the credential manager selection, some of them have a self-interest to promote their own credential manager a little more than the alternative. And I think it will, over the long run, it will pan out. And there's a nuance here. This is some of those passkey or credential managers might have been bootstrapped and others might not. And this is a real issue. By the way, that's another issue that I filed at the web authentication specification in that repository. Right? It would be great if the relying party could say, I would like to use a credential for that user that would just work, right? As opposed to bootstrapping, asking the user to bootstrap a completely new credential manager in the hope that the credential would be there, which I could use for authentication, or at the creation time, right? Put it in a credential manager that is easily available to me as a user, as opposed to a credential manager, right, that I might need to download or to bootstrap. Right? So for me, that is one shortcoming that doesn't exist yet. I hope we will get to that situation, because I think there is value in making the process simple for the user. Right? Sure, it must be the choice of the user which credential manager to use, which, by the way, was a significant concern we heard in the past, that user said, I don't want the vendor login, right? And now I must use this company's credential manager. I can't use my own. Right? So we have an open choice for the user. That's a great situation, but it adds complexity to the whole process. But it would be great if the user would either say, right, I install a new one and I bootstrap that new one, and the bootstrapping would be part of the installation process, as opposed to being penalizing the passkey creation process for yet another relying party, which has nothing to do with that credential manager and the credential manager choice, right? And making it hard to get a passkey for that user created in the first place. So it's not an easy situation, but in order to resolve it, we first have to dissect, right? What are the influential factors here, right? We had the first one is add-ons and the need for those. They are a problem, right? They need to go away. The second is platform-mediated credentials. That is the future for various reasons. Happy to dive into that, right? And they need to do a good choice and a very neutral way of presenting the choices to the user, and it would be great. Number three, if relying parties could say, limit that to the easily accessible, meaning in some way immediately available credential managers, as opposed to the ones that still need to be bootstrapped, right, when creating a new passkey.
Well, I'd like to point out that I was using Chrome and I was trying to use Google Password Manager. So if they were entitling or preferring their own browser, they did an awfully bad job, because I had to hit cancel twice before I found the Google Password Manager prompt.
I
So I
could
think
give you
clearly
other examples where it's the opposite. Whatever. I'm not blaming anyone here. I'm just saying this is a complex situation, and we need to work on a good solution, right? And even make it easy for the credential manager vendors to use platform APIs to plug into, as opposed to having the need to write add-ons, which always get in the way.
this question I've sort of been wondering for a while, but one thing is adoption of those 5 billion passkeys more, the percentage of that more on mobile? Because I showed you how in the browser it can get quite complex, Do I have a security key plugged in? What browser am I using? What do I have a browser plugin that maybe is a passkey provider? So it can get quite complex in the browser, but in the mobile app where you have like complete control over the experience, you probably don't have to deal with as much of those edge cases. So of the 5 billion passkeys, what do you know what percentage of that is mobile?
I don't know the exact numbers, but for me, it is not about native app, what you meant with mobile versus browser. It's
Mm-hmm.
about any app, even web apps on the mobile device versus web apps predominantly on desktop systems for various reasons. The first, we users have been trained through the native biometric support of our smartphones, right, to use biometrics. And this makes it the adoption of passkeys much better on mobile devices than it is on desktop devices. On desktop devices, people have an anxiety in some way, right? They're at least more hesitant to use biometrics to create a passkey, and not everyone has Windows Hello enabled, and this we get into a completely different platform. The second is on a desktop PC, add-ons and plugins are a problem. On a mobile device, they don't exist. Right? You have browsers without add-ons, without plugins, they just work. Right? Which, in my opinion, is the hygiene, right, of on mobile devices is different because the platforms work in a different way. That the benefit to start later, right, and do some things differently than they could do on desktop platforms, and this is why the complexity on desktop platforms is higher, right, and it's harder to get the user experience to the same degree, combined with users have not been trained to use biometrics on those devices in the first place.
So we talked about, and the episode is titled the 5 billion devices out there or credentials out there. But what are some of the other metrics that you're looking at with your FIDO Alliance hat on for a second? What are some of the other metrics that you're looking at to
So,
sort of gauge how you're doing?
so the end goal, right, is not having many passkeys out there. It would be having many passwordless accounts or phishing-resistant accounts. I think it's even the better term, where there is no phishing-prone alternative, right, path to get into that account, and not through sign-in and also not through account recovery, meaning especially no passwords, no OTPs, no magic links. Right? For me, that would be a great outcome if we would get to that. However, right, this is a different measurement. That doesn't mean we are counting passkeys. It means we are counting phishing-resistant accounts, which is already a different measure, which is not measured today. But in order to get there, right, the outcome or the goal is one thing. The other thing is, what are the metrics we need to understand what can be improved, right? What helps us to make it actionable, right? This is an important thing, and we need way more metrics for making it actionable, right? Typically in the success rate, right? The authentication time, you can read a lot of things from the authentication time, right? Are you, for example, overloading the user with different decisions in the sign-in screen? Right? I'm not sure whether you have ever seen the Atlassian sign-in screen where you have whatever 10 different icons, right, for all the different federation providers. You can sign in through Microsoft and all the, right? How would I know, right, which one to use? At some point, I remember that, but right, this is a mental load, right, which makes adoption harder. So finding the right user experience, that is not an easy task, because we in the Western world grew up with passwords. We have to now in some way unlearn that and be open for a new approach to authentication, and understand what it means to be passwordless, right? And just having an entry field for a username and one for the password and one for the pass key, right? A button for using pass keys, and maybe another one for account recovery, and maybe another one for security keys, right? That's too much, right? Especially for users that don't have a pass key. Why should they even see that pass key button, right? So I think that is where improvements can happen, and that is where you as a relying party need to pay attention on the user experience that you're creating in one situation, but also how you measure that to understand where to improve. right? Is the latency the problem? Is the user thinking and maybe not deciding what action to take the problem, or does it just not work, right? Because he has to press the cancel button 4 times, as you showed in your example, right? We need to understand as a relying party where the user is, and that requires very specific measurements and ideally systems that can suggest improvements to you, as opposed to leaving you in the dark with nice charts, right? That doesn't help.
So if I could pivot for a second to the enterprise space. So let's say I buy into this story. I want to reduce the number of phishing or phishing vulnerable accounts. So I drank the Kool-Aid. But actual deployment of this technology it's not that simple, actually. And I'm going to do another quick screenshot. This is a record for screenshots of um, on IOH. But just to show, this is our Gamma flow designer for building workflows for authentication, and this is the passkey. And you can see actually that these flows are quite complex, and you can call other flows, and so the flows get pretty deep. So the business logic that you need to implement is actually can be complicated for enterprises. And for enterprises, it's not just it's rolling out OTP was so easy, or magic links is so easy, but actually rolling out passkeys, it can be quite challenging. And it's not like you roll it out and you're done. It's like you roll it out and you have to see how it's going and how you can entice users to move towards phishing-resistant accounts, like you say, and get rid of their passwords. Can you talk a little bit about some of the enterprise challenges, like how we know the big guys like GitHub can do this, like GitHub's passkey implementation is amazing. But does this flow down to Fortune 500 and enterprise? Do they have the hacks and the bench to be able to pull this off?
Yeah. So for me, the user experience is one of the hardest parts, at least on the implementation side. And in general, right, I often use the analogy of an iceberg. Right, as a company that wants to deploy passkeys, it looks so easy. Right? You create a passkey, you trigger the use of a passkey, and now you're done. Right, and the reality is it's a little more complex than that. There's a lot of hidden complexity, which makes it harder, right, to design the user experience in the right way and implement that in the right way. And that is where companies often underestimate the effort to do so and to maintain that and improve that going forward. Right, and but you're right. A passwordless or a sign-in dialog that supports passkeys as well as passwords and OTPs and other authentication methods is not an easy thing. It's typically thousands of lines of code. Right. The question is, what is the right level to implement that in a machine, right, in your app, right, and what is the right level to or the right method to configure that in the backend. Right? I would argue that on the implementation side, you don't want to hardcode the user journey, right? You want to rather have a generic implementation like a widget that you can easily plug into that system. And second, on the server side, a configuration, I'm not sure that the flowcharts help anyone. I think rules are much better suited, but that's my personal opinion. You can typically convey or convert a flowchart, which is like an A3, right, large document, and it's fully printed into like 7 rules or so, right, and that is easier to maintain and easier to write in the first place. So for me, it's about those methods, and then it's about the user experience design to understand what you can influence in a platform-mediated credential world and what platforms will do for you and how to best optimize that based on the information you have about that user. One example, right, if you have a user sign-in dialog with ask for a username, the password, and then has a passkey button, right, and I click on that passkey button even though I don't have a passkey as a user, right, this is a mistake. In my opinion, it adds mental load to the user to understand whether I have a passkey, yes or no, and it opens up the door for a dead end, right? If I don't have a passkey, I click on that button, right? It's very likely I end up with FIDO cross-device authentication. Now I get presented a QR code, which I scan with my mobile device, because I always scan QR codes with my mobile device, right? Which finally tells me, oh, sorry, you don't have a passkey, right? This is a dead end. So, but the mistake is in the first place. Why am I, relying party, showing a passkey button to a user that I know doesn't have a passkey? I should have never done that, right? So, and this is if you look into the sign-in dialogues, how they are constructed, they are the typical single-page ones. Many people use those, but I think it's much better to use the identifier first flow. Right? Ask for the username first, then you understand which account it's related to, and whether that really has a passkey or not, and how to design the second page. Right? You have information, leverage that, use a platform that makes that easy to you. Right? For me, this is one of the takeaways or the learnings, right? Lessons learned over the past years.
I was going to say we have been saying use identifier first authentication for like 10 years, but it could be more like 12 years. It's been a while. I think everyone
It will take a while, but I think the advantages are clear, right? They're very obvious. If you count the number of decisions users have to make, right? What are the decision points? Like reading the password field. Do I want to put something in, right? Do I want to click this button or add this checkbox, right? This just count those things. Make it easy for users.
Okay, so last question, and then we'll go to last thoughts. So what I've been saying to people is that passkeys are for everyday authentication because they're really convenient. And wallet credentials are for registration. So passkeys for authentication, wallets for registration. Because the wallets have more friction, which is sort of built into the process. And also that so I wouldn't want to use my wallet to do a wallet presentation every single time I return to the website. It's higher friction for a reason. And plus, I don't need to release my credentials again. I already registered. So I guess my question is I want to make sure that I'm saying the right thing. Do you agree with the sort of oversimplification of passkeys for authentication and wallets for registration?
Yes, I fully agree with that. And I think there is NIST made a very similar statement, right? That MDL are designed for the sign-up, the identity verification, and passkeys are the ideal solution for the authentication, right? The returning user, for various reasons, right? What you mentioned, the additional friction is one generic thing that's true. And if you look into the details, wallets are not anywhere near the maturity level we have reached with passkeys yet. Right? There's a lot of dynamics in there. Which wallet are you using? How does it work? What kind of credential type you are using? Because the user experience could even depend on that. And are you really sure you want to ask the user to share identity attributes like a PID credential, like an MDL, right, with a relying party, when the user just wants to sign in and expects to see a sign-in dialog, right? So I fully agree with that. I think that they complement each other, right? Digital credentials solves the sign-up identity verification problem, right, where selfie plus picture ID is being used today. And with AI deepfakes, we see the limitations from a security perspective of that approach.
Okay, I think birds should be flying any second now. So there they are. So I guess before we move on, I just want to give you a chance. Any last thoughts or summaries? This is a pretty wide-ranging discussion. Events, stuff that's happening at OneSpan we should know about.
For me, maybe one aspect here, right? So I mentioned before, passwords and OTP solutions are over-the-top authentication methods, meaning the app doesn't have to rely on any platform APIs, right, to really use those credentials. But they have security limitations and they have user experience limitations. Passkeys are the first type of credential that really is platform mediated. Digital credentials is the second one. And I think we are on that path, right? The AI agents will continue to be on that path. You could consider AI agents being yet another platform. They will have to use platform mediated credentials as well. And I hope you don't share your password or your passkey directly with that AI agent. And that has an impact on how relying parties should think about the authentication. In the past, we were, as relying parties, pretty much focused on running individual controls, right? Like the length of the password and the character sets and no repetition of characters in it, right? And the frequency of changing passwords. Where now, I think relying parties are more in the way to orchestrate the trust around that. And this has becoming a trust interpreter. I think that has a huge impact on how to set up infrastructures on the relying party side and how to think about authentication going forward, because we are not done yet, right? Passkeys are continuing to evolve over time. Digital credentials are have just started in some way, right? And we are in the middle of that development, and the AI agents, authentication and verifiable delegation to those, right, is the next thing which we already see on the horizon, right? So things are coming. Pick the right partners to help you implement it.
Okay. Thank you for that. So I just want to, there'll be notes up. It's always the same, glue.co/IOH- the episode number. This is episode 217. So I'll have the takeaways and some links. And I just want to do a quick reminder for everyone to please follow the live stream on LinkedIn and YouTube. That really helps us. We're trying to get to 3,000 followers. Even you, Rolf, make sure you follow. Sometimes we get one at a time.
Yeah, and share the link, right, to that.
Yes. Yeah, please comment and share. That really, LinkedIn algorithms really mean. So by tagging people, commenting, sharing, it really does help us get the word out. And I'll announce our next guest, Oracle veteran Eleanor Hayes Merritt. And we're going to talk about agent trust registries. Rolf, I resisted going down the AI rabbit hole because I feel like every other episode or 3 out of 4 episodes are about agentic stuff, but that might be a topic for another time, because I do think we're intersecting with that, and FIDO has a role to play, especially on the transactional side. I think that's really interesting.
I agree.
So, okay, Rolf, thank you so much. Thank you for all your contributions and hard work. And I think if you add up all the hours, you probably did more work on FIDO than it would take to get a PhD.
Potentially, yes. Right, since whatever 2012 I started, so that's a long time ago. And yeah, but I think I'm happy where we are. And thank you, Mike, for having me.
Okay.